now to the ongoing tension between the United States and North Korea over that country's alleged development of its nuclear weapons. In an interview today with Bloomberg, President Trump said if the circumstances were right, he would meet with North Korean President Kim Jong-un. President Trump has also said the U.S. should be prepared for the worst. Recently, North Korea threatened to sink the USS Carl Vinson and a U.S. submarine. In the meantime, U.S. forces in the South Korean military are conducting joint military drills in the Korean peninsula. RT Simone Del Rosario has just arrived in Seoul, South Korea, and joins us with the latest updates coming out of the region.
One of the biggest updates coming out of the Korean Peninsula today is this perceived threat made by North Korea's foreign ministry, indicating the supreme leader could order a nuclear test at any moment. A spokesman for the foreign ministry said this is in response to the U.S. wanting to kick up sanctions and pressure against North Korea, saying if the Trump administration's policy against Pyongyang is maximum pressure and engagement, which is what they're calling it, then Pyongyang is going to maximize and bolster its nuclear deterrence. Now, we're reporting to you today from Seoul, South Korea, which is about 35 miles south of the border. On the north side of that border, North Korea does have artillery that could hit us right here in the South Korean capital. This has been a potential threat for those living south of the border for decades. Remember, these two sides are still technically at war with each other. Back in 1953, all sides in the Korean War signed a ceasefire, but they never agreed to a peace treaty. So this hostility can deeply affect those living south of the border, including the 10 million people right here in Seoul, about 25 million people in the metropolitan area. Well, what we've been reporting is that the U.S. is setting up a missile defense system here in South Korea called THAAD. And there's been a big controversy as to which government will end up paying for it. It has $1 billion price tag. Today, the South Korean Defense Ministry said this issue is not up for renegotiation. The U.S. will pay for the system, despite President Donald Trump's comments last week that he wanted Seoul to foot the bill. The U.S. and South Korea are under an agreement that South Korea will provide land while the U.S. will provide funding and maintenance for equipment like this. But this equipment, this missile defense system, it's controversial on its own, not only for North Korea, but China also does not like it being set up, saying it impacts its own military operations. And there are some South Koreans who are against it as well, thinking that it just makes them a target to North Korea, provoking the country to the north.
The DPRK has suggested it will continue to test nuclear weapons, saying it will bolster its nuclear force to the maximum in a consecutive and successive way to defend against U.S. aggression and hysteria. Earlier this year, U.S. President Donald Trump said a major conflict with the DPRK over its nuclear and ballistic missile programs is possible. Pyongyang has carried out 5 nuclear tests and a series of missile tests in defiance of UN Security Council resolutions. The tests were conducted at an unprecedented rate, and the DPRK is believed to have made progress in developing intermediate range and submarine launch missiles. Washington said Seoul say the DPRK conducted an unsuccessful missile launch on Saturday.
More now on that long-range missile test that U.S. officials say is set for Wednesday of this week. Jennifer Griffin, live at the Pentagon with that. Jennifer.
John, it's been planned for at least 6 months, and Fox News has learned the U.S. Air Force will conduct another long-range ballistic missile test on Wednesday. The new test of a nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, comes 1 week after a similar test in the wake of growing tensions on the Korean Peninsula. That missile was fired from Vandenberg Air Base in California and traveled roughly 4,200 miles before splashing down near the Marshall Islands, 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. The Minuteman III missile, launched Wednesday by the Air Force, will be unarmed, officials say. The new U.S. Air Force missile test comes days after another failed North Korea missile test on Saturday. Last week, the North Koreans, in a show of force, fired artillery at a nearby unpopulated island to mark the 85th anniversary of the founding of its army. In another show of force, Fox News has just learned that the U.S. Air Force flew a pair of long-range B-1 bombers from Guam, just south of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone that separates North from South Korea. They were escorted by South Korean fighter jets, John.
And where is the aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, right now?
Well, it's interesting to note that it finally arrived off the coast of Korea this weekend. As the U.S. Air Force gears up for another long-range missile test Wednesday, the USS Carl Vinson Strike Group will be in the waters off the Korean Peninsula in the Sea of Japan. Vinson will continue doing training operations with the South Korean Navy. The new U.S. Air Force missile test comes days after another failed North Korean missile test on Saturday.
Donald Trump has opened up about the difficult decisions he's had to make since taking office. In a recent interview with CBS News, the president shared why his decision to strike Syria gave him pause to think. Caleb Maupin has the story.
While Donald Trump seems to be demonstrating the military strength of the United States with his Tomahawk cruise missile attack on a Syrian airbase and now threats against North Korea, we seem to have seen a different side of Donald Trump in a recent interview he gave to CBS News in the United States. In this interview, we see Donald Trump acting more like a showman, walking around the office, boasting about the bigness and the strength of the Oval Office and the impact it's had on people. And then we see him opening up about the tough decisions that he has to make and the danger of possibly killing the wrong people in Syria and elsewhere.
Most importantly, you know, the decisions, like when I made the decision to go with Syria, the 59 Tomahawk missiles, you're killing people. And you can kill the wrong people, too. I hate it, but things have to be done.
Now, at one point, he shows the audience a red button on his desk, which he says is for ordering soda. However, he says that he, quote, uses it to mess with people who think that it's the nuclear button. In the earlier selection of the interview, Donald Trump was asked about the danger of starting a war with North Korea. When he responded, he was quite unclear about exactly what he intended to do about the country. He didn't really give a clear answer. And from there, he gave words that almost sounded like he was praising or had some kind of respect or admiration for North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un.
If he does a nuclear test, I will not be happy.
Not happy mean military action?
I don't know. I mean, we'll see. Obviously, he's a pretty smart cookie, but we have a situation that we just cannot let.
Later, Donald Trump even came forward and said that he would actually be honored to meet Kim Jong-un, but under the right circumstances. Here we can see Donald Trump doing what he's known for, which is being unpredictable. It's never really clear what Donald Trump is going to say or do next. However, what is clear is that there are millions of people, not just in the United States, but also around the world, who are glued to their TV screens waiting to see what happens.
Tensions are rising between Turkey and the U.S., with both countries moving armored vehicles to a northern Syrian town near the Turkish border over the weekend. The U.S. closely monitoring the area after cross-border fire between the two countries. Turkey's leader once again demanding the United States stop supporting the Syrian Kurdish militants. Our national security correspondent Jennifer Griffin joins us live from the Pentagon with the very latest on this and why it matters. Jen?
Hi, Jenna. Well, clashes and cross-border firing between American-backed Kurdish forces and the Turkish military have increased in recent days. The tension is so bad that over the weekend, the U.S. military deployed small units of special operators along the Turkish border, waving American flags and driving armored Stryker vehicles in a show of force to deter the Turkish military from attacking the Kurdish fighters that the U.S. is relying on to defeat ISIS. The Kurdish forces have made gains outside Raqqa, and the U.S. military believes they remain the best chance they have to capture the de facto ISIS capital. Turkey's president, who just consolidated power in a referendum, wants to convince President Trump otherwise.
It is deeply saddening for us that there were U.S. flags on a convoy that carried rags of that organization, the YPG.
The Turks consider the Kurds terrorists. Last week, Turkish warplanes surprised their U.S. ally by bombing 3 locations in Syria and Iraq, killing at least 20 U.S.-trained Kurdish fighters, angering American commanders and the Pentagon. The surprise airstrike has frayed relations between the NATO allies. The Turkish president is in India today, but issued a stern warning to the U.S. about working with the Syrian Kurds to fight ISIS. The U.S. has been weighing whether to provide heavy arms to the Syrian Kurds, who have been the most effective fighting force against ISIS in Syria. Right now, U.S. troops are caught between the Turks and the Kurds in northern Syria. The tensions are likely to come to a head when President Erdogan visits the White House for his first meeting with President Trump on May 16th.
Firing tear gas and rubber bullets. Turkish police breaking up May Day demonstrators in Istanbul on Monday, detaining more than 200 people around the city. following protests on the annual workers' holiday. Unions had said they wouldn't attempt to march on Taksim Square, a traditional rallying point for anti-government protests which is off-limits for demonstrators. But that didn't stop a group trying to reach the area, only to be met by riot police who had a heavy presence across the city. Tensions are particularly high after President Tayyip Erdogan's narrow referendum win last month gave him sweeping new powers. Since the win, Erdogan has conducted 2 purges targeting the police, civil service and military.
By some accounts, up to a staggering 150,000 civil servants have been suspended, and just last week 10,000 police officers were reportedly suspended, 1,000 of whom were detained. Over the weekend, another 4,000 public officials were reportedly sacked, including 1,000 Justice Ministry staff. With such a large number, it's highly unlikely that the suspensions and detentions will have met due process standards.
Erdogan says the measures are necessary given the security threats facing Turkey. Authorities also blocking access to online encyclopedia Wikipedia over the weekend, citing a law allowing the banning of access to websites deemed obscene or a threat to national security.
President Trump asked for an extra $30 billion in defense spending in this year's budget. Congress gave him about half that, and Trump might not even get all of it. The latest government funding bill includes an additional $15 billion for defense, but almost $2.5 billion of that is locked away at first. In order to get the funding increase he wants, Trump will have to present Congress with some kind of plan for defeating ISIS. That's something Trump's been reluctant to do in the past.
I don't want to broadcast to the enemy exactly what my plan is.
On the campaign trail, Trump said it would be tactically unsound to reveal his anti-ISIS plan before executing it. The $2.5 billion incentive might change his calculus a little. Trump signed an executive order in January asking the military to draft a new strategy for defeating ISIS. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said last month the plan is still being fleshed out.
Russian television network has released video footage of an attack on the opposition leader Alexei Navalny. The footage shows an unidentified man throwing a green antiseptic called Zelyanka into Navalny's face. However, Navalny has criticized the broadcaster for blurring the face of the assailant. He says he fears his eye may have been permanently damaged.
This was the last time Chancellor Angela Merkel visited Russia and President Vladimir Putin. Their relationship has been somewhat strained.
The problem is lack of trust. I think there is fundamental concern in the West that Ukraine perhaps was just one example of what Russia could do. There is also significant concern about alleged Russian meddling in European Union elections, and these are critical elections.
The war in Ukraine has played a large part in souring relations, as did the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 in 2014. The annexation of Crimea and the ensuing European sanctions have hurt the Russian economy. It'll be a main topic of conversation, but no one is expecting any breakthroughs. Another issue, the war in Syria. Russia has helped turn the war in President Bashar al-Assad's favor. The Kremlin has always been clear on its insistence for Assad to stay in power, at least for now. Economic interests could be discussed too. Germany is one of Russia's main trading partners, and economic and energy ties have largely survived the sanctions imposed in 2014.
Politics aside, the two leaders share somewhat of a personal history. Angela Merkel, once a quantum chemist, grew up in East Berlin and she speaks Russian, while Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, was stationed there and he speaks German. The two leaders are often quoted as having a deep mistrust of one another, but many also say that there is mutual respect. It's a relationship that has kept the media entertained.
This moment in 2007 shocked many in Germany. Putin invited his dog Coney into their meeting. Merkel is known to be scared of dogs, but she didn't flinch. Talking Ukraine in 2014, the Chancellor's mobile rings. That could be Putin, she's told. Guaranteed not, she replies. And just recently in March, a German delegation visiting Moscow sent her warm regards to Putin. She reminded me many times not to forget, the president is told. Among the serious issues facing these two leaders, many will be looking forward to their news conference in Sochi for any clues on where their relationship now stands.
The German chancellor has called for an end to Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen, saying there's no military solution to the conflict in the war-torn country. Angela Merkel, who arrived in Jeddah on Sunday, backed the United Nations-led process of diplomatic resolution to the Yemen crisis. She also called for an end to, quote, the extremely bad humanitarian situation in Yemen. However, an agreement was signed during Merkel's visit for Saudi soldiers to receive training at German military facilities. German federal police are also to give instruction to Saudi border guards, among other things. Growing fears that German-made weapons are being used in Saudi strikes on Yemen. Just in 2016, Germany exported more than €500 million worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. Berlin says the weapons could still be delivered to Saudi Arabia on a case-by-case basis.
Residents have taken to the streets to protest against Israel and to support Palestinian prisoners on a hunger strike. About 1,000 prisoners are entering the third week of strike action, with detainees only taking in water and salt. The strikers have gained backing through social media, and people are now demonstrating daily to support them.
The Palestinian movement Hamas has unveiled a new manifesto that softens its language towards Israel. The new policy has the group accepting the formation of a Palestinian state along the 1967 borders. This would include the besieged Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank and the East Jerusalem. The new document still rejects Israel's right to exist, but does not contain explicit call for its destruction. Hamas is also cutting ties with the Pan-Arab Egypt-based Muslim Brotherhood.
Venezuela has hiked its minimum wage by 60%. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro said April 30th, quote, "We're here to take care of the workers, those who are most humble." The lowest paid Venezuelans will now take home about 200,000 bolivars, which is less than $50 at the current black market rate. It's the third minimum wage hike Maduro has ordered this year, and its announcement comes as Venezuela's economy tumbles. Venezuela has one of the highest inflation rates in the world, and the unemployment rate is expected to climb to over 20% this year. The minimum wage hike was also announced during a time of massive political unrest in Venezuela. Large-scale anti-government protests swept across the country throughout April, leading to violent clashes with security forces. Nearly 30 people have been killed and hundreds have been injured in the protests.
The EU is being warned that if it does not reform, it could see France quitting next. But perhaps surprisingly, that's from the normally pro-EU French presidential candidate Emmanuel Macron. Charlotte Dubensky's got the details in Paris.
It does seem to be a big shift in policy. Mr. Macron used this interview to talk about his relatively short-lived political career, how the fact that he founded the En Marche campaign only a year ago. And since then, and during this entire presidential campaign, he has said and painted himself as the most pro-European candidate of all of those who stood out of the original 11. He's talked about the fact that he wanted greater integration in Europe. And what we see in this interview appears to be a rowing back on that stance.
If the day after I decide to follow up and pursue the current functioning of the European Union, I will betray my people. I don't want to do so, because the day after we will have a Frexit or we will have the Front National again.
Now, Marine Le Pen also used her rally today to criticise Emmanuel Macron and a number of his policies. She once again dubbed him to be the successor of François Hollande, the current president of France. And she talked about the idea that Mr. Macron wanted the Uberisation of the economy, the deregulation of all professions. And she said that he won't name who he would anoint as prime minister if he became president, because he just doesn't want to frighten voters, and he wants to gain as many people from the left, the right, the centre as he possibly can. This is what she had to say.
In this election, the system is imposing its candidate on you. François Hollande is imposing on you his protégé. And here you have Fillon's new best friend, who he once called Emmanuel Hollande. We can see Hollande leaving through the door and then climbing back through the window.
Well, protests are also due to be taking place in Paris today against that presidential candidate Marine Le Pen. There are also protests being held across France on this public workers' holiday, just a few days now before voters in France go to the polls, and it could be a far tighter race than many people are thinking.
Hundreds of thousands of people are marching and protesting across the country Monday. May 1st is known as May Day. It's also known as International Workers' Day. But demonstrators this year are standing up for a variety of issues, including LGBTQ rights, immigration reform, and changes in police conduct. The first May Day protest was May 1st, 1886, when U.S. workers went on strike in support for an 8-hour workday. But the protests turned deadly in Haymarket Square in Chicago. International Workers' Day was heavily endorsed by socialist and communist parties, so in 1921 it became known as Americanization Day in the U.S. Then, in 1955, during the Cold War, Congress and President Dwight D. Eisenhower renamed it Loyalty Day. The purpose of Loyalty Day is to recognize, quote, the heritage of American freedom, and each year since 1958, the president has issued a Loyalty Day proclamation. In this year's proclamation, President Donald Trump asked Americans to not only express loyalty to individual liberties, but also to a limited government. International Workers' Day protests took place this year around the world, including in Paris, where demonstrations turned violent amid France's divisive presidential election.
Moving on to other stories now. Wearable devices, a big part of people's lives today. The evolution of these wonderful gadgets continue. We might be able to have them on like a second skin. Cho Sung-min introduces to us a new functional material developed by a team of local researchers.
A group of Korean researchers developed a way to create wearable devices that could further enhance their versatility in the future by using a new functional material. The newly developed patch-shaped material is 50 micrometers thick, making it flexible enough to fit on any surface of the user's body. In other words, wearable devices made with this material can be worn on the arm or back of one's hand to check time and make a phone call. To make the wearable device, researchers used a new developed plastic plate called flexible printer circuit board as a main frame and applied drops of liquid plastic that work as glue on the plate. LED chips are then planted before the glue hardens. And lastly, wires made of silver connect the chips. The most complex part of the process is connecting the silver wires at the end, but the wire structure can be easily designed through printing technology.
By using process output, we can print any images as they're drawn on the board. In this way, we can keep the cost down and even make the circuit board in bigger sizes.
The researchers say this new technology is expected to be especially helpful in the field of healthcare, as such wearable devices could be used to monitor heart conditions.
A China-based news agency posted a video last week featuring its first interactive robot report, Jia, conducting an interview with Kevin Kelly, the founding executive director of Wired magazine. Jia is able to understand dialogue and make subtle body movements and microfacial expressions. She can respond to basic questions like, "Who are you?" and "How old are you?" But her movements are restricted, making her look more like a mannequin than a human.
And a massive storm system that killed at least 16 people in 5 states is heading towards the East Coast. 4 tornadoes killed 4 people in Texas over the weekend. The same system caused 4 deaths in Mississippi and Tennessee.
Further north, flooding claimed at least 8 lives in Arkansas and Missouri. That's where our Tony DeCopel is. Tony?
Nearly a foot of rain has fallen in Missouri since Friday, creating dangerous conditions like this. The Current River, which is about 4 blocks that way, crested at nearly 40 feet. That shattered a 100-year-old record, put water at about chest level here, and sunk almost all of downtown. Missouri's governor has declared a state of emergency, and the National Guard has been called in to prepare for conditions that are only expected to get worse.
Torrential rain sent rivers overflowing across Missouri, swamping neighborhoods and even washing away this tractor trailer.
Oh my gosh!
In many parts of Missouri, this will be a flood of historic proportions.
Governor Eric Greitens reported nearly 100 evacuations and almost 36 rescues.
Oh my gosh!
In Texas, an outbreak of at least 4 tornadoes leveled homes and buildings, including this barn where high schoolers were getting ready to celebrate prom. No one was hurt. Chris Ingram was one of the roughly 20 people inside.
These are the 2 restrooms that we took shelter in. There's also, I think, about 5 people that hid in this stairwell.
Moments after the twisters passed, cell phone video captured strangers jumping into fast-moving floodwaters to rescue 2 young children from this overturned pickup truck.
I got a baby! Call 911! Baby!
Both children reportedly survived.
Here in Van Buren, a curfew was in effect overnight and the power has been cut downtown. But the river is finally receding after breaking that 100-year-old record. There's a lot of debris and a difficult cleanup process ahead, that's for sure. In Arkansas, 2 children are still missing after being swept away from their mother, and this storm system is now moving east, where it's expected to drop heavy rain all along the East Coast, including severe thunderstorms in western Pennsylvania and New York State.